Hello and welcome to History Respawn Podcast. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we are celebrating the year that was in history games with the 2022 History Game Awards. As in years past, John Harney and I will be giving out awards in a variety of categories, as well as crowning the History Game of the Year. However, this year's award show will also feature History Game of the Year nominations from some special guests, who have kindly provided us with their choices in a set of short and pleasant audio recordings. I'm incredibly excited about this new development. I hope you are too. So, to get started, let me introduce my co-host on History Respawn, the man who somehow convinced his college to buy him a Steam Deck for, quote, academic purposes, Professor John Harney. John, welcome back.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. But I am
Good.
very interested in learning a little bit more about this requisition purchase of a Steam Deck for your job. Walk us through that process. What was the application like? Who did you have to murder to get it? What happened?
It was relatively smooth, but now as part of my annual self-summary of a lot of jobs have this. I'm sure you do too, Bob. I have to summarize how my year went, and I'm supposed to account for how I spent funds. Like, uh-oh, I thought I was in the clear. So who knows? The short version, I mean, it's a weird way to say it, but when I'm teaching video games classes, and you and I teach similar classes in this, it actually solves a ton of problems.
Yeah.
We had a computer in the room last January, and it had been set up for VR, and for some reason that made it just randomly not work. Like I couldn't load up Journey to the West, this kind of like sci-fi remake of the Chinese class. It just wouldn't work, this 8-year-old game. So weirdly enough, the Steam Deck actually is, and this sounds weird, I know, it's the low cost solution from a kind of an education standpoint. So yeah, so far, let's see how it goes. I probably should write something now, though. That would be good. Maybe starting with a conference, that might make it a bit easier.
Yeah, well, congratulations to you. I was a sucker. I had to go through the pre-order process for Steam Deck. I got into the second batch of decks that were sent out in the spring. I was patting myself on the back, and then here you come along. You don't even spend your own money, and you get one for
And it
work.
took like a week.
For work. Yeah, it's
Out of
ridiculous.
nowhere, Valve was like, "By the way, we just send them now." It's just like it's like buying anything else. That was the weirdest thing because for like a year it was like, "Give us money and pray," which is what you went through.
Yes, that's
And
exactly what
now
I
you can
did.
just buy a Steam Deck. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is
and now
great.
you can just do it. You can do it with your academic job, which is,
Yeah.
with the what is it, right wingers? They always complain about academic malfeasance, and I feel like your name should just be right in the dictionary for that phrase now. Okay,
Oh
well,
man,
so John, are you ready to
I'm
explore
ready.
the year that was in history games? Send
Yes.
out some awards. Okay, excellent. So we're going to start things with the games that are under consideration. And so these are games that John and I have looked at, that our guests have mentioned and looked at as well. And so all of these games, we probably won't get to all of them in this episode, but if you're on this list, then you're in good company. This is a good set of games here. So, starting out, games under consideration. These are in no particular order. I've got Pentiment, Horizon Forbidden West, Victoria 3, The Hajj Trail, Case of the Golden Idol, Atari 50, NBA 2K23 My NBA Era Mode, Ozymandias Bronze Age Empire Sim, Zonzo, Steel Rising, Plague Tale Requiem, The Excavation of Hobbs Barrow, God of War Ragnarok, NORCO, Cults of the Lamb, Expeditions Rome, Weird West, Immortality, Card Shark, and I left the easiest one to pronounce at the very end, of course, Train to Sachsenhausen. And then those are the games that we kind of looked at for this year, and these are our categories here for the History Game Awards. First category is Shoutout Games. Next is History Games for people who don't like history. Best History Game Character. History topic we learn the most about. Best Game for the History Classroom. Best Old History Game. So this is a game that came out before 2022. Most anticipated history game of 2023. Non-history game of 2022. So this is just our favorite game that didn't have any relation to history, or maybe it does and we just feel like giving it an award. Who cares? It's our award show. And then lastly, most importantly, the one you've been waiting for, the history game of 2022. Okay, so those are the games, those are the categories. So let's start out with our first category, which is shout out games. And to start us off, I want to play a clip of audio from one of our special guests for this Game Awards episode. Now, I've listened to all these audio samples here. John has not heard them, so we will get a fresh reaction in this audio recording. So let's see if this works. And John, I guess as I'm playing this, give me a thumbs up if you can hear it or not.
Hi, my name is Kate Cook. I'm an Associate Lecturer in Classics at the University of St Andrews, and I'm a specialist in the representation of women in historical video games, particularly ancient world video games. I've got a couple of honourable mentions I'd like to give before I get to my history game of 2022, mostly because either one of these games might have been my game of the year, were it not for a late entry that stole the show. And these are Expeditions Rome and Crusader Kings 3, both of which I had to play for work this year, and both of which I ended up exploring for quite a lot longer than was necessary just for that work. They're quite different. One is a tactical RPG, one is obviously the kind of grand strategy game that the Crusader Kings series is known for. But both of them, I thought, explored stories in a really interesting way and shone some really nice and unusual insights into particular periods of history and particular ways of thinking about history. However, my game of the year is, as I've mentioned, a late entry, and is likely to be, I would imagine, quite a lot of people's game of the year this year, and that is Obsidian's Pentiment. Pentiment, it makes my game of the year for two main reasons. The first is that it is just beautiful. The manuscript-based style, you play as an artist who is working in a monastery's scriptorium to begin with, and he kind of follow him through his career. He doesn't stay in the scriptorium, but initially he's working as a kind of artist on manuscripts, and the whole thing is designed as a manuscript. So when you want kind of glossary for particular terms, you can zoom out away from the immediate game and you see the sort of book that the game is based inside. Characters are all drawn as manuscripts, and there are kind of beautiful scripts used for the character speech bubbles to distinguish between characters of different levels of education, or, for example, the printer and his family and anyone else you meet who do kind of printing work, all speak in a printed type. The people associated with the church, particularly the more educated members, have lovely kind of copperplate, fancy handwriting, whereas other people in town speak with more casual or kind of less, I suppose, well-formed scripts. The attention to this kind of manuscript style, I think, is just beautiful and really effective. But Pentiment, for me, also brings up a really important second thing, which I really appreciate it for, and that is the variety of stories and the kinds of stories we get in this game, and particularly, for me, the stories of women that Pentiment shows. I've been saying for some time that one of the best ways that I think we can get better representation of women in historical video games is to stop telling the same stories over and over again. So stop focusing on war and combat, stop focusing on kings or kind of military leaders, and in that way we'll see more different kinds of people's stories, and that will also kind of shine light on a sort of non-aristocratic people as well. But it'll be a really brilliant way to bring women to the forefront, and Pentiment has come along and done exactly that. The story of Pentiment is focused on this kind of small town with the abbey associated with it. You begin the game staying with a local family in the town, including two women. You get the chance to kind of speak to some of the nuns associated with the abbey. And it was, when I was speaking to, as part of this game, speaking to a nun about how she finds that the presentation of Dido in the Aeneid is sufficiently sexist to put her off the poem, and there are therefore other books in the Abbey's library that she prefers, that I kind of really got a sense of how much this game was willing to engage with these different stories and these different perspectives. There are kind of women who will talk about how their choices were constrained in terms of what kind of lives they could pursue because of their sex. And there are opportunities to go and join, or kind of watch rather than join in on, but watch a spinning bee and get to hear the kind of local women sharing their stories. It's just a really fantastic range of different voices that we don't often get in some of these historical games, and packaged, as I said already, in a really beautiful, stylized way. So it has absolutely made my game of the year for this year. If you'd like to talk to me more about Pentiment, or if you'd like to know more about women, particularly in ancient world video games, I have a recent edited volume that's come out, and indeed that we did a History Respawned episode on, so you can go and listen to that. And you can find me on Twitter at CatEx, KATEXE. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was Kate Cook. Kate, as she mentioned, was recently on for an episode about her new book from Bloomsbury with Jane Draycott called Women in Classical Video Games. And she was there talking about Pentiment as her nominee for History Game of the Year. And I liked her audio here because she had a couple of shout-out games, including Crusader Kings 3 and then Expeditions Rome, which is a game series that many listeners on History Respawn have asked us to cover, and we haven't done it yet. So I'm glad that Kate gave it a shout out there.
We need a month of expedition games one of these months, starting Conquistadors, and just go. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we need to do a deep dive on that. So, John, why don't you tell us about your shout out game for 2022?
Sure. My shout out game is Weird West. I liked Kate's comments about Pentiment. This is, I guess, time to confess I haven't played Pentiment yet. It's been a crazy end of the year.
Hey, that's why we have multiple people on this, is because there's so many history games now that like you and I can't possibly play them all.
No kidding. But her point was such a wonderful point, I think. The type of story you choose to tell, and then the kind of the way that you tell it. So for me, Weird West is kind of very accessible in that way. It's an interesting amalgam. It's kind of just a top-down strategy kind of game type thing, but it's set in this quasi, horrified version, I guess, of the Old West. But I just really liked it. It's one of these games, I'm a sucker for games that are kind of like tangentially historical, if you know what I mean, that are like completely clearly using very clear historical influences, but not consciously engaging with them in any kind of massive way. So the Weird West is this whole kind of element of the undead and the afterlife to it. But still, you're walking around in a cowboy hat, and it's subverting these tropes that are kind of there. And, if you told me 15 years ago that we'd be talking about the American West with things like Westworld and games like Weird West and Hard West 2, which I haven't played but I've heard really good things about, I would have been pretty shocked if you told me that 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But here we are. And then Weird West is just, it's a good time. I think it's worth people's time. And I don't know if it still is. It certainly was on PC Gamer, the PC Game Pass for quite a while under Microsoft. It's probably still there. So if you subscribe to that service, you should go and have a look and see if it's there. And it's worth at least a couple hours to kind of dip your toe into for sure.
And is it something that you could play with a controller? Do you need to be, is it kind of desktop? What's the story there?
You can play on a Steam Deck. You can.
John, do you hear yourself right now? Do you hear yourself?
It's very controller friendly. And it's I've only played it on my desktop, but it doesn't seem like a very demanding game that way. And actually, even though I do this a lot now, I put games on easy, but I've been sitting back and just playing it and letting these characters interact, and the game has a lot of character, which I like, and it takes the West as this jumping off point and just goes into complete weirdness. It's an aptly named game. So whether you're interested in kind of occult vibes, bit of that this year, or cowboys, or if you just like a good strategy game, Weird West is worth a look for sure.
Awesome. That sounds like definitely what I'm going to check out. Another game, my shout out game, one that is like John's and it's kind of tangentially related to history, is The Case of the Golden Idol. And this is a game from a Latvian developer called Color Gray Games. And so the Case of the Golden Idol is I can just read what the developers say. They call it a deduction game, a detective game. And they themselves refer to it as the spiritual successor to Lucas Pope's Return of the Obra Dinn, which came out in 2019. And was Return of the Obra Dinn, I think, is my favorite game of the century so far. And so having a game like this that, kind of it takes the same sort of mechanical notes and kind of the same sort of storytelling techniques, it was just right up my alley. And so the setting for this game is the 18th century, and it occurs over the span of, I think, 40 to 60 years, from like the kind of early 18th century all the way up until the beginning of the 19th century. And it follows the kind of trials and tribulations and murders of this kind of weird family that comes across a golden idol somewhere in the New World, in the colonial world, brings it back home, and it leads to all sorts of disasters, much in the same way that you have in Return of the Obra Dinn, with kind of an artifact from the sea leading to the disaster on board that ship. And so the way that this game plays is it plays very similar to Obra Dinn in the sense that you are investigating a murder scene that is happening, is kind of in the midst of happening. So in some cases, somebody, like the very first murder, somebody's literally just been pushed off the ledge to their death. In another one, somebody has spontaneously combusted. And so you have characters who are reacting to that, and you are looking at the scene in a way that's very reminiscent to a 1980s or early 1990s LucasArts adventure game. So it's kind of got that pixelated retro style. And so you are rifling through people's pockets, you are opening up pantries, while people are reacting to this murder that has occurred. And it is a game that, again, is a spiritual successor to Obra Dinn, but it's a game that has a wonderful and perverse style and humor all its own. And I absolutely loved it. It's on sale now on Steam, I think until the 5th of January. And so if you're looking for something to play that's short and sweet, and you can play on a Steam Deck, as hoity-toity John Hardy just mentioned, this is your type of game.
I want to say as well, I'm just in awe of the stones of those developers, because in certain nerdy circles like ours, comparing yourselves to Obra Dinn or anything Lucas Pope has done is like, okay, you guys are confident. I like it, and good for them for delivering. That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
it's really good. It's been on a lot of Game of the Year list, and then it won the award for narrative from Indiecade for their 2022 awards. So like you said, you talk a big talk, you got to back it up, and I feel like they did. Like it's definitely something. They're doing a couple of things. They're playing homage to Lucas Pope, but then they're kind of paying homage to early 90s adventure games, kind of like the Tim Schafer adventure games, Maniac Mansion. It's got that same kind of weird, perverse and off-kilter form of humor. It's just a really great package, and I think it's on sale for like $12 right now. Easy recommendation. Yeah. Easy. Okay, so that's our first category. Let's move on to our second category, which is history games for people who don't like history. And to start us out, I'm going to play another guest audio clip, and here we go.
Hello everybody, my name is Chris Kempshaw. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter, and I am here to talk about my history game of 2022. Now, I was very tempted when thinking about this to pick my current ongoing save on the sports simulator game Football Manager, as it's the game that I've probably played the most this year in the process of moving house. However, it's not history at the best of times, and I've now reached 2049 kind of year-wise in that game, which means it's moved a very, very long way away from anything historical. So I think that probably rules it out. So The game I'm going to pick is a game that I played with Bob and with my friend and colleague Dr. Vander Wilcox on an episode of History Respawned, which is the first-person shooter game Isonzo by the makers of Verdun and the makers of Tannenberg. And the reason I've picked this game is kind of multifaceted, really. Firstly, and I say this with a lot of love and a lot of understanding, with the best will in the world, I don't think that many people knew that Italy were in the First World War and necessarily cared that Italy were in the First World War. But what you've ended up with Isonzo is a game that is really lovingly produced and reconstructed. The developers, particularly Jos Hobe, have gone to incredibly kind of great lengths to craft a vision of the Italian front during the First World War that they've reconstructed from photographs and from kind of primary sources and the like, and they've married it to the existing first-person shooter technology and infrastructure that existed in Verdun and in Tannenberg. So the game looks fantastic. I'm not particularly good at it, but that's not a high bar for whether a game is any good or not. But what I find particularly interesting about Isonzo is the fact that in itself it represents a triumph. That first-person shooter First World War games didn't simply die out at Battlefield 1 or die out at the end of the First World War centenary. The developers of this franchise of games is clearly riding the crest of a very noticeable wave, and that it wasn't an alien, ridiculous idea for them to decide to make an Italian first-person shooter game. So what we've got with Isonzo is a game that is gorgeous, it is very good fun to play, and it's also exploring a part of history that is so under-acknowledged and under-explored in historical computer games that, to all intents and purposes, it didn't exist before Battlefield 1 briefly touched upon it, and then Isonzo really dived right into it. So that is my historical game of the year. I definitely recommend you give it a go if you've got it or you've got the opportunity to play it. Whilst there are still players, eventually those servers will become a little sparse and die out, but they're planning a good number of expansions and the like to add in new content, which is very interesting and very exciting. So yeah, if you are interested in historical games and historical first-person shooters and the First World War, I definitely recommend giving Isonzo a go. Do I want to plug anything when I finish? Well, you can always get hold of me and hear my kind of historical First World War computer gaming musings on Twitter, assuming that Twitter is still alive by the time this goes out, or the likes of Instagram and Hive. All of those are at Chris Kempshaw. I have a book out at the moment. It's called The History and Politics of Star Wars, Death Stars and Democracy, which I like to think is very good and very pleasing. So definitely take a look at that. There's a 25% discount code on my Twitter page at the moment. You can see on the pinned tweet, which means that if you end up buying like 6 or 7 copies, then those savings really start to add up. So it's definitely worth exploring. But aside from that, Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy New Year. And I look forward to hearing and seeing more historical computer games chat in 2023.
So that was Chris Kempshaw, favorite here, History Respawned. And I wanted to play Chris's audio there for our category History Games for people who don't like history, because I think that Chris has done a really good job with computer games, but then also with Star Wars, of kind of, leading in with historical knowledge and kind of making that interesting for an audience that might otherwise not care at all. And then I also liked it because his kind of initial gut reaction to go with Football Manager was something that spoke to me and my nominee for this category, which is NBA 2K23 My NBA Era Mode. So NBA 2K23, this is the kind of AAA release each year annual NBA basketball game. And this series over the past decade has really included a lot of historical modes, and kind of most famously, they've been known for their modes focused on exploring the career of Michael Jordan. I think that started in 2013, 2014, where they had a kind of a Michael Jordan mode where you could go through and play through his most famous games, his kind of biggest career moments, his biggest shots. and see if you could replicate them. In this new mode, however, in my NBA era for this newest game, you can actually go back and play in historical eras going back to the early 1980s, also the 1990s, and then the distant era of the early 2000s. You don't necessarily have to play as Michael Jordan. You can pick any team, and that team will have a historically accurate roster that you can play as, and you can go through and play through one of these decades, the 1980s, 1990s, or the 2000s, and see what you can get up to. See if you can make your team kind of the reigning dynasty in the 1980s instead of the Celtics or the Lakers, or see if you can overcome Michael Jordan in the NBA playoffs during the 1990s. And so it's just a really in-depth historical simulation, and it's one that I've never seen in a sports game, let alone an NBA game. And, John, you and I looked at MLB The Show's historical mode, I think a couple years ago, and you could play like kind of famous historical moments in that mode. But in NBA 2K23, through the My NBA Era mode, you can play an entire season as a historical team. So I started the 1980s with my favorite NBA team, the San Antonio Spurs, and I've got Iceman Gervin, and I'm trying to get us into the playoffs. But then a part of me, the game mode that I'm in, it starts in the 1983 season. A part of me wonders, well, shouldn't I just tank? Shouldn't I just purposely lose every game so I can get Michael Jordan in the 1984 NBA draft? And so it gets into all of these fun kind of historical what ifs of these different eras in NBA history, and getting the experience to play as famous historical players. It's just a really cool mode. And we used to have a category here on History Respawn for these game awards about best dad game, dad in quotes. And I feel like this game really tops that list for me this year.
I feel like there should be a mini game if you're playing anyone who isn't Jordan in the early 90s of like, press X, press these quick time events to avoid randomly insulting or upsetting Michael Jordan, so he doesn't like take it personally and destroy you.
Yeah.
It's what his whole. A quick sports shout out for me actually as well. Out of the Park Baseball, that series is still going. It's still fantastic. It's still an acquired taste. But if you have any interest in baseball or even just sports management, you can go and you can decide, I want to be the 1927 Yankees.
Oh, cool.
Or I want to be some other team in 1927. I think it goes back as far as the 1870s. And it's just an incredible idea. But I think what 2K kind of has over that is this more, what's the word I'm looking for? More immediate kind of, you're playing Jordan, I guess, or you're playing.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing. This makes you want to buy a basketball game for the first time in years. Actually.
And real fast, in addition to having the historical players, historical stats, kind of historical money options for the different teams in the different cities, they also do a really good job of historicizing each game with presentation. So when you're playing in the 1980s, you get a kind of a veneer over the screen that makes it look like an old CRTV. And then you also have older NBA announcers. These are people who are still on the radio, but they used to be on TV back in the 80s and the 90s. And so they've come in and done commentary, pre-recorded commentary about games and players from the 1980s. It is really, really, really cool.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's way far. That's so further beyond these companies ever go,
Yeah.
Or that's amazing. That's amazing. Well, I don't know why I feel bad because my game is not a sports game at all. My game of Total History. But in the same way that I think the NBA 2K23 is like playability is a big thing. I picked Cult of the Lamb, which I think of as a highly, highly playable game. For people who don't know, Cult of the Lamb has been described as kind of a crossover of kind of like Animal Crossing / Dungeon-like, which has actually kind of been done, like the Rune Factory series and things like that have done things like that. And it is a bit like that. It's a beautiful look. I love the way the game looks. I love the way the game sounds. I find the game very charming. Although you can do horrible, horrible things to your cult followers. It manages to do it and make you smile while you're doing it. Like a lot of these games, it kind of struggles because it doesn't want to get too easy because then the game kind of becomes pointless. But you kind of hit a bit of a ramp up after a while. But it's a real, despite that, it's a real kind of sit back and play kind of game. And you can down hours in it before you've even realized that you have. And you can kind of spend more time if you prefer on building the little village. You can go out into the dungeons. And but it definitely belongs here because the game kind of centered on defeating these bishops. You're effectively a cultist who's been recruited by some kind of, it seems to be at least at the start, a kind of an antichrist type figure to take down this organized religion, which is ostensibly just made up for the game. But for example, the first boss you face is called Leshy, which is a direct reference to Russian folklore. And all the bishops are kind of referenced after these kind of folkloric, what, certainly the Christian world used to call pagan kind of traditions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of fun, this game is deliberately doing some fun things with that. And kind of they're successfully detaching themselves from preconceptions what organized religion is, under this veneer of it being, oh, it's just a fun game where you form a cult or whatever. So there's kind of some stuff that's gone on there with Cult of the Lamb, and I think of all the games I played this year, it was the easiest to just pick up and play for like 30 minutes to an hour. It's got that Dead Cells, Spelunky type thing where it's like, I can play that. I can play that for a bit here before I watch TV with my wife,
That's awesome. And, that's actually one of the reasons, that playability and that kind of time sink, that's one of the reasons why I didn't play this game, is because I was worried that if once I started Cult of the Lamb, I wouldn't play anything else. And so I'm holding that for next year, but I'm glad to hear that you really enjoyed it and you recommend it.
Definitely. No, it's really good. Definitely. We're barely through this. We're barely started this podcast. Like, God, a lot of good games came out this year. It was a great year.
Yeah, we are spoiled, and I'm really glad we have people, guests who've been willing to share their thoughts with us, because otherwise we would have too much of ourselves, and then there's so many games. I mean, there's so many games. There's too many games. All right, well, let's talk about some more games. So our next category is Best History Game Character. So this is a character that was introduced to us this year in a history game. And this could be somebody who helps kind of enliven our knowledge of the past or just makes the game more fun. So, John, I'm going to let you go first. What was your Best History Game Character from 2022?
My Best History Game character was the Comte de Saint-Germain from Card Shark. People who don't know what Card Shark is, it's this game set in 18th century France. Beautiful looking game, really wonderful kind of design choices and artistic choices, how to present the game. It is kind of a collection of lots of mini games where you play this kind of down on his heels young man who is the Comte de Saint-Germain, who was a real historical figure. He teaches you to kind of be a cheat and to be this kind of cad and this kind of cat about town. But the Comte de Saint-Germain has kind of political, maybe even anarchic kind of ideas what he wants to happen. This is briefly before the revolution, effectively, in France, and you meet Voltaire pretty early in the game, and you sit in coffee houses and tea houses and all this kind of stuff. And we'll talk more about Card Shark, I think, later in the podcast. But the Comte de Saint-Germain, I like him because he's a fun character. He's just kind of fun to be around. He's effectively the tutorial character in some ways at the outset, but it doesn't really feel like that. And it's a nice way that if you're playing this game and you Google Comte de Saint-Germain, you're like, oh, this guy was weird. Like, this real guy who existed, who's a strange person. Wait a minute, there were lots of these guys? Like, yeah, if you were born into high society and had nothing better to do, you could be a weirdo for 40 years. That's kind of what he did. And so I like that about him. And he's representative of Kate made this point earlier, telling different kinds of stories.
Yes.
He's just a different type of historical character to pluck out and to show to the player. So I really like him for that reason. I thought he was great, and he's just a great, within the game he works really well as well mechanically.
Yeah, he's fantastic, and he's I love how the developers have presented him, because he's very nurturing, especially at the very beginning, and kind of walking you step by step through this process of learning these cheats and kind of helping you with your grammar as well, kind of educating you, because you start out as kind of a lowly not a waiter, I don't know, tavern assistant. I don't really know how to put it, but
Yeah.
you are kind of a lowly peasant who happens to be working in this tavern that he comes by and decides to kind of take you under his wing. And he's just a really effective portrait of kind of 18th century life, 18th century thought process, and then kind of the corruption of the ancient regime. You're like, you kind of look at it like, oh, you know what? Maybe the revolution was a good idea. Maybe this was something that was worthwhile. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
we'll come back to Card Shark. That's a huge strength
Yeah.
of the game, actually, I think. And that character kind of personifies that. And I'd forgotten, yeah, for people who haven't played the game yet, you'll be on your way to the next tavern or whatever, and he's teaching you the next mini game you need. And so it's like, do you want to go through that again, or are you ready to rest? And you press rest as the character. Okay, let's get back to your letters. And there's this very kind of, uplifting / enlightenment thing he's doing, which again kind of fits the time period.
Yeah.
So it was good.
Yeah, exactly. And, he gets along well with Voltaire, and, it kind of fits into that kind of, I don't know, 18th century zeitgeist of,
Right.
kind of a changing era. But he doesn't want it to change too fast because, he wants to rip off these rich nobles while they still have money and influence. So my best history game character of the year is Alva from Horizon Forbidden West. And so Alva is a kind of a difficult character to talk about because she comes in, I'd say maybe past the halfway point in Horizon Forbidden West. And Horizon Forbidden West, this is the sequel to Horizon, what's it called? Zero Dawn, sorry. And so this is the game with the kind of cyber dinosaurs, this kind of future
Dystopian
world,
Aztecs.
dystopian Aztecs. Yes, exactly. Starring Aloy, big PlayStation game. And this game, Forbidden West, I think it's longer than Zero Dawn. So it's like 50-hour game, 60-hour narrative. And so Alva comes in at like halfway through that, like 30 hours in. But she's a really impactful character, not only because I think her voice actor is really good. Allison Jay as her voice actress. But also because Alva reminds me a lot of myself as a young historian. So Alva's role is that she is with a society called the Quen, and they are located in kind of the Pacific. They don't really talk about where in particular they come from, but they have come to kind of this world in Forbidden West, in what is the destroyed ruins of San Francisco. And Alva's character is what's known as a diviner. And so her job is basically to be a historical researcher. She is going into this destroyed version of San Francisco to learn more about the origins of her people, and then in particular to learn more about the history of their leadership structure, which is built around somebody called the CEO. And so there's a lot of really funny kind of modern day commentary that's built into Quen society, and I don't want to spoil that for anybody who's interested. But what I love about Alva is she becomes a part of Aloy's crew. And so in Forbidden West, you have kind of this Mass Effect thing that goes on where you are getting a group of allies coming together to help Aloy deal with problems in this game, in this world. And during that kind of building of the team, you run into Alva, and she provides a lot of kind of interest in how the history of the world is perceived by people of this era. And not to spoil too much, but Aloy knows what happens. She is kind of the historical expert. But Alva is kind of the graduate student to Aloy's professor, and she has got a little bit more knowledge, but she really relies a lot on Aloy to fill in the blanks, and in particular to overcome some of the misperceptions that she has of the people that already exist in the West, right? So the Quen, they have a very negative opinion about anybody who's not reached the same level of advancement as them. But Alva comes to realize through her exploration, through her study of ancient texts, so old computers basically, that things are way more complicated. And a lot of the stories that she has been studying and learning and kind of promoting amongst her people, but then to others that she runs into, those are based on lies. And so it's really kind of compelling portrait of what happens to people when they go into the archives and they study primary sources, or they begin to study historiography, and how this changes their perception about kind of the old stories of the past that they've heard from their parents, or they've heard in primary or secondary schools, but now they kind of get into graduate school and they kind of learn, how is this meat processed, right? How's the sausage get made? And it kind of flips her perspective. And so my nominee for best history game character, Alva, from Horizon Forbidden West. And I'd like to talk, I could talk for an hour about her, but I'd like to leave it up to the listeners to go and explore her character, because it's really well done, really compelling.
I love that pick because I feel like a couple of years ago when the first game came out, you and I were like, no, this is kind of a history game. I know it's about cyber dinosaurs in the future, but it's really about this kind of past. And for the second game, it's the developers are like, oh yeah, it's totally about that. Like the second game is entirely about digging into like the past.
Yeah.
And the game does some really interesting ideas as well around how society is structuring itself and how power structures work, because that's a big thing for her, right? She's suddenly like, oh, now I'm at odds with the power structure in my society, which I kind of wasn't before. And and people are kind of rolling their eyes at the power structure. Some people are, but what are you going to do?
Yeah.
He's in charge, and it's in our texts, and that's the way it is. And human societies were like that for a long time.
Yeah. And
some still are,
exactly. And she goes into this game trying to further entrench a historical narrative that has been built up by her society and by the CEO leader. But she comes out of it basically being a key debunker in that narrative, right? Kind of flipping the script and changing attitudes. And it's really compelling. It's just really well done. And I think that whole game's great, but I think her position in particular is just fantastic. I love it. All right, well, let's move on and let's talk a little bit about the history topics that we learned the most about in 2022. And I'm going to go first, and I'm going to say cheating at cards in Card Shark. So this is a game John talked about a little bit at length, or I should say at length, with relation to the Compt. And I have been playing it quite a bit as well. I played about 3 hours of this game. And I can't wait to get back into it, mostly because of the history, but then also because of these card mini games. So over the course of kind of the early hours of this game, you learn a series of card tricks that you will use during the game in order to swindle rich players and to help the Compt swindle these players. And so initially you start out kind of very comically as a waiter in one of these taverns, and you help the Compt with his high stakes card game by looking over the shoulder of the patron he's playing against while pouring them wine. And so it's a really fun mechanic because you have got to use the controller to pour the wine. But then you've also got to kind of lean over at the same time and look at the cards that they have, but you can't linger too long and look at the cards, or else the wine that you're pouring in will spill over. And so it's kind of like a con artist trick, very simple one. And then later on, you are able to participate directly in the card games themselves, and you learn different shuffling techniques. You learn different techniques about how to use the cards, how to mark the cards in order to kind of predict what's coming down from the shuffle and from the dealer as well. Sometimes you get to play as the dealer, and so you can stack the deck in favor of the Compt. And it's really a lot of fun, and they're really fun and compelling mini games. Although I would say kind of one point of criticism in playing with the controller, I'm not sure it's the same way with mouse and keyboard, but playing with the controller, I was sometimes confused, particularly with the shuffling techniques. I was sometimes confused as to which card I was picking up and marking and sending to my ally, because I often felt like I should have been doing it in the opposite direction, that the cards were laid out, but sometimes the first inclination that I had was the right one. The game, I feel like in some places, doesn't do a good job of, describing to you as to what exactly is going to happen when you hit a button. So that's a little scary. It adds to high stakes tension, but I think overall, learning how to cheat at cards in the 18th century is something that I'm looking forward to explore further in 2023.
Yeah, and they balance that kind of tension if you could screw this up quite well. Like, but you can't. It doesn't become this frustrating thing you keep getting wrong per se, unless you're old like me and it's like, oh, which direction for diamonds again or something like that.
Yeah.
We done this for recording, Bob. It really feels like a DS game, like and I mean that as a compliment. Like it's spiritually a Nintendo DS game in so many ways. If you could reach out with the stylus and grab the suit rather than worry about pressing left at the exact right time, maybe it would be a different game then. But no, it's great. And it feels different from other games.
Yes.
Without doing anything kind of crazy. In terms of his topic I learned the most about, I had Card Shark down as well in part. I have two games, Card Shark and Victoria 3. My topic, a little bit embarrassingly, is 18th and 19th century Europe. Although I'm not a specialist of Europe, but I do teach global history. So when I talk about global history, but to be honest, by the time we're getting to the 18th century, I'm already sharpening my knives to get into imperialism. That's kind of what I really want to talk about. 19th century imperialism, in part because we can talk about China a bit more, which you know a lot more about, of course, and the scramble for Africa and everything else. But like Card Shark, what I like about it is like I have read about the coffee houses and tea houses of the 18th century, and I have read about the circles in which Voltaire and others kind of traveled and everything else. And this game attempts you to kind of introduce you to those circles or expose you to them. So very early in Card Shark, you meet Voltaire and you're showing him how you are cheating him at cards, and he knows that and he finds it hugely entertaining. And he wants to learn about people, and it's just, this is a good take, and this is a good, I think, representation of that kind of cultural milieu that these guys are kind of floating around in. I think some people kind of criticize it now, which is not unfair either, but I think that was interesting. And then Victoria 3, Bob wrote a piece on this for the website, which I thought was really good, and I'll talk about again actually in just a second, in terms of the kind of history the Victoria 3, the approach to history the Victoria 3 is kind of inviting you to use. But I had never thought about trade so much in my life as I did playing Victoria 3, and just again forcing me to stop, because I'm not a specialist in this period, so forcing me to stop and think about the granularities of who built what when and which countries kind of became industrialized first. So, for example, I would recommend, if you have Victoria 3, to play the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. I found it a very enjoyable playthrough, and it's really interesting because you kind of run into this buzzsaw a little bit, where especially the southern part of Italy is pretty agrarian, and the game, and this is how they've interpreted it, but it's not a terribly unfair take of early 1800s Italy. And so it just kind of, I found that it stimulated my thinking about the period in really interesting ways. And I liked that about Victoria 3, which that game surprised me a lot, actually, in a lot of different ways this year, in good ways.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, based on what I wrote on the website, I have a kind of a complicated take on Victoria 3, but I do think it is really useful to have some, like you were saying, kind of that kind of step-by-step experience with what were the kind of key developments in this era that led to, the age of high imperialism, as we might call it. And I think, too, you saying, like, you were kind of embarrassed, saying, oh, I learned a lot about 18th, 19th century history. And it's like, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I feel like that's kind of the viewpoint of History Respawn in general, is that we aren't one of these websites where we are saying, you and I saying, we know everything there is to know about these topics. That's why we have guests on, right? That's the whole point. And so to say that you learned something from these games, or you kind of had a better appreciation of it, I mean, that's fantastic. Like, because how boring would it be if we knew everything about all of these games, or knew everything about the backstory or the history? It's like there's always some different viewpoint, some new perspective that you can get about the past by playing it as a game. instead, even if it
Yeah.
was something like, for you're focused on modern China, right? I'm sure even from that, there could be a perspective coming from a game developer coming in a game format that could be wholly new, that could kind of change the way you look at things. And so I kind of think that too with Victoria 3, but the perspective that they're putting out, at least for me, is not one that I'm too keen on. But that's not to say it's bad. It's not to say it's bad. It's just it's not how I would present it. But that's great. I think the more of these games that are out there, the better it is, I think, in general.
Well, I unified Italy basically as a European economic superpower that never got into wars, but still colonized a little bit of West Africa. So it's kind of, it's kind of that's the issue. This bleeds into the segues a bit into the next topic, Bob, because I could talk a little bit about how
Go
I
for
use
it. Please do. Yeah.
well. But for that to work, could you expand just really briefly on, we've kind of mentioned that you have a take on it, but you didn't quite exactly specify. So could you very briefly let the listeners, but seriously, because like this actually helps me explain how I use it in the classroom too. Like, what is the historical approach Victoria 3 effectively doesn't just endorse? The mechanics of the game are kind of based on it, really.
Yeah. And so our category now that we're moving into is best game for the history classroom. And so John's nominee for this, I'm just going to step on it, is Victoria 3. And so my position on Victoria 3 as somebody who studied modern imperial history, 19th, 20th century European history in graduate school. I took many classes. I read, or at least touched over 1,000 secondary sources. That's 1,000 history books on this topic. My perspective is that Victoria 3 promotes a very old-fashioned version of imperial history, one that is focused on numbers, that is focused on kind of trying to understand the process of imperialism, of colonialism, of industrial development by studying statistics, by studying numbers, quantitative history, as we would call it. And I think that kind of position was one that was very much in vogue in the mid 20th century, particularly with Marxist historians. And it is one that has been overtaken in the past 20 years, past 30 years, I would say, with cultural analysis. So instead of looking at numbers and statistics and official records, cultural historians look at cultural artifacts, books, novels, correspondences, cultural festivals, anything and everything that's not a number, basically, is part of cultural analysis. And so my position is that, this game, Victoria 3, can give you a kind of a good sense of the kind of mechanics of imperialism, of colonialism, but in order to get a true understanding of what that actually meant, what it actually entailed, you need to have cultural analysis, because I feel like with Victoria 3, even though this is a game that's focused on this era of history, it's still too distant from it because it's focused on numbers. There's a human side to the story that you're not getting by just looking at population figures, by looking at the very fancy steampunk spreadsheets that Paradox provides with you. And I say this as somebody who's biased. I'm a cultural historian, and I've been raised and taught with cultural analysis, and so I look at the kind of history it's promoted by Victoria 3, and I was like, where are the people? Where are the stories? And it's like, well, you come up with them on your own. And I just, for me, it's not good enough. So that's my take.
Excuse me. Well, I've been trained that way too. So it's just kind of funny because it's kind of, what was the price of gold in 1772? I'm like, I don't know. I don't care about that at all. Victoria 3 really cares about it.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say about Victoria 3, and we haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, Bob, is, there's two ways to read it. As you play the game more, you start to get a much clearer opportunity to pick which way your society is going. So, for example, I could turn Italy into a socialist state, or try to do it, or something like that, in a similar way that you can do in other Paradox games. At the same time, it's done in this very much, interest groups way. Like, there are industrialists, there are trade unionists, there's the prime religion. So you still get into this very kind of numbers based, or mathematical kind of construction of history. The other thing I say about it as well is it takes forever to get there. It takes forever to get there. Like
Yeah.
I think that there's a counterpoint to your critique of the game, but only people who've put in maybe 60 hours minimum are ever going to have any
Yeah.
concept, and that's a lot
Yeah.
to ask. So the funny thing is, I picked it for my best game of history classroom, and for years we've been doing this, and I've been saying I'd love to pick a Paradox game, I just can't do it. And usually when I teach the class, there's one student who comes up to me and says, "Can we do such a Paradox game?" And I look that young person in the eye and I say, "You and I are the same, but we cannot do it because everyone else in this room is normal.
Yeah.
We're not able to do it. We cannot do it." So, and Victoria 3 is no better. In fact, it's probably worse. Victoria 3 is a very strange game in that nothing actually happens directly. Oh, you want the standard of living to improve in central Italy? Go and do these three things and wait 5 real-time minutes while the game goes through a year and see if it works. But however, I would use the game in a very scaffolded way. In part, I would show the students, look at the kind of things the game wants you to do. I might even have them, Bob, read your piece, for example, or certainly talk to them about it. And I think, funnily enough, although it's not the kind of game I could just let the students play for half an hour, like we play Sid Meier's Civilization and we talk about it. What is this game more or less telling you to do, really? Like, really, Um, attack Native Americans more or less, and what actually happened, and how do we think about that? Victoria 3 is doing that kind of same thing with these kind of high concepts. So I really think it could be super useful. And the other part of it is, I've told some friends of mine in the economics department about this game, and they're losing their minds with excitement
Yeah.
over this.
I bet.
Because I'm like,
Yeah.
well, my basic goal is to change the price of a good, but I can't do it directly. I have to modernize the workplace and hire people, and they're like, "What? Can you show me this game?" They're like, for them, it's like an excellent. It's hilarious because it's such a good fit for some of the things my economist friends want to do
Yeah.
for the exact reasons Bob is criticizing it. And that historians like myself and Bob, I think the vast majority of historians our age, Bob, have been trained with at least cultural competence, if not
Yes.
full-on cultural historians. So it's an interesting shift. And so in the classroom, every year I try and think, what could I let my students play, or what would we all play together and talk about? This wouldn't be like that. This would be
Yeah.
me, maybe even honestly just showing them a 10-minute video, not even playing or showing them, look
Yeah.
at what we can do in the game. But I couldn't let them touch it. It'd be a very rare. It'd be an exception to the rule in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of Paradox games, this one, probably even more so than others, it feels like an intricate train model that as soon as you touch it, it's going to break. And so
Yes.
there were many times when I played it about 35 hours or so. I didn't even get to the 60-hour mark like you did. But the feeling like, oh, I'm just going to let this run. I'm not going to do anything to it. I'm just going to let it run and see what happens, right? Just let it go. And you can have a good time just doing that. So that's an idea for the classroom, is just kind of like, just let it run on its own, let it fast forward maybe 5 years, and then let's see what the numbers look like. But again, for me, it's always like, okay, let's see what the numbers look like. And I'm sitting there as a cultural historian, it's like, okay, well, these numbers represent real people's lives. They have real stories. We should learn about those. That tells you more about the experience of imperialism than numbers do. Mostly because, well, can we really trust the numbers? Probably not. Also, do the numbers really tell us the reason behind imperialism? Probably not, because the French and the British, they never made money off of these things. So why were they doing it, right? That's a cultural story.
Right.
I'm sorry. But
that's interesting. The game, like, you have to do a little bit of like going through tutorials and stuff. But the weird thing with Victoria 3 is you should probably be in debt like all the time to play the game effectively, which is such a strange thing.
Yes.
But actually it goes to what you just said.
Yeah, you're right. But I would say, to be fair to the game and to give it some credit, I would say that in a world that is awash in cultural histories of imperialism and empire, that having a game experience like this might be useful, because there is some utility in learning the quantitative basis for historical events. Now, I would argue, is it more effective than cultural history? No, I wouldn't say that, but it is still useful. It is still worthwhile. So,
I've noticed as well. Sorry to cut across you, Bob. I think the last couple of years, maybe there's an uptick among certain students as well, to be able to talk about, hey, the way we study our past has changed, and there have been distinct phases in the last 60 years. and I can talk to you about those, you
Yeah.
know. And so it's funnily enough, like even though this is somewhat anachronistic, it hopefully we'll see when I'll report back when I've done it. Was this a good way to get that conversation started or not, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't wait to
Well,
hear.
how about you? What's the game you're looking to
Yeah,
teach
so
or
best
you'd like to
game
teach?
for the history classroom for me was the newest game from Charles Games. This is the developer of Attentat, 1942, Silverboda, 1945, a couple of very worthwhile and highly recommended games about the Second World War in Czechoslovakia. And so their newest game was a free mobile game on Google Play and on the App Store called Train to Sachsenhausen. And so this is a game that sees Charles Games depicting the closing of Czech universities in November of 1939. So this is kind of the beginning of breakdown of Czech society during Nazi occupation, during the very beginning of the Second World War. And the game, in terms of mechanics, it's an adventure game in which you play a student of medicine caught up in this occupation in Czechoslovakia. And the game mechanics are reminiscent of really successful mobile games, including Rain, in which you were playing the game by making choices by swiping left or swiping right on the screen. And so I recommend this game because it is a free mobile game. So it's one that students can get readily. They all have mobile devices, or at least, I'd say 98% of students have those mobile devices. And then it's also a game that can be completed in one sitting, right? You can take, 20, 25 minutes to play through it. And so it's a game that you could use in a lesson plan in a classroom. And I think this game, I don't want to kind of spoil the elements too much, just spoil the story, but it's a game that plays upon the kind of important historical topics, historical narratives that Charles Games has already explored in Attentat and in Silverboda. So these are kind of issues related to historical memory about the Second World War, related to occupation and collaboration during the Nazi era, and of course related to the Holocaust and kind of concentration camps on the beginning of that process. So just a really awesome bite-size free historical game that came out for mobile devices. I just think it's easily the winner for me in this category.
Here, and can I just say on accessibility, this time last year we were at the AHA in New Orleans, and we talked about this, and I was so encouraged to meet people who are like, I want to talk about games in my classroom. I don't know where to start. I myself don't really play or such and such. And I'm sure there's people listening who feel the same way. This accessibility issue is just enormous. And we
Yeah.
had a bit of fun talking about my Steam Deck at the start of the podcast, but part of my reasoning really was students can come to my office and sit there and just play the game for 25 minutes, like Victoria 3, for example, is the opposite of Train to Sachsenhausen in terms of accessibility. It's just like, forget it. You have to have a pretty decent PC. So that sucks. And I think that people forget that because we're all video game nerds and we're all just used to spending our disposable income on this.
Or making our
So,
university pay for it, right?
well, if we can. But yeah, God bless Charles Games. I feel like we should say it every year, but they're doing awesome things.
Yeah, basically every time they come out with a game, it's in this awards contest. And so,
Totally.
yeah, just, we're putting a good list together of, favorite history game developers. They're in the mix for sure. And, Paradox too, for different reasons. And I think it's interesting, John, for this category, we've got two very divergent games in terms of playability and play style and accessibility, but yet they are two worthwhile games for this category all the same. I think that's really cool.
If I could say briefly before we move on as well, and I feel so old saying this, but now that we've been teaching for over a decade, Bob, the change has completely happened. Next Tuesday, I start a month-long class about history and science fiction, which is largely focused on films. But I'll have to do a couple of games in there somewhere because it'd be weird if I don't.
Yeah.
And we've gone from guys shoehorning games into classes to where like if I don't have a game somewhere, there'll be a chunk of students going, "That's why don't you want to talk about such and such?
Yep.
This is about science fiction. Why do you want to talk about Assassin's Creed 2 or something like that?" You know,
Yep.
so and that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a cool thing.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So our next category is best old history game. And so this is a game that had come out in previous years that we have gotten around to this year in 2022. And to start us out on this category, I've got another guest recording.
Hi, my name is Ann Lady McDivitt. I'm the Academic Technology Specialist for the History Department at Stanford. My history game of 2022 is The Legend of Heroes Trails from Zero. Why this game in particular? Because it came out in 2010 technically. This one is actually quite unique. It's a turn-based JRPG. And the reason why I'm putting it forth here is because this game is finally getting a Western release. This is the first time it's officially released in the West, based off of a fan translation that was created in 2020, which was then used as the base for an official version that came out for PC, PS4, and Nintendo Switch, which the Nintendo Switch and PC versions are the versions you would want to play for sure. But the Geofront team put a lot of work into this, and I find it completely fascinating that the fan translation, instead of getting shut down, was actually picked up by the publishing company and used for the official release. And I hope that everyone would go check out Trails from Zero. It's a fantastic video game. It's very story-based and has some fantastic characters. It's a great showcase of the hard work and dedication of the Geofront fan translation team, and it's great to see it actually get an official release. If you want more from me, you can go to annladium.com. You can find my podcast there. You can find some of my columns there. You can also find me on Twitter at annladium.
And so Anne's recording there got cut off. I don't know if that was my fault or hers, but it was mine. Obviously, it was mine. I won't throw her under the bus here. But Anne was a panelist on an Organization of American Historians panel that I did on history and games, and she's the author of a book called Hot Tubs and Pac-Man, Gender and the Early Video Game Industry in the United States, which was published by De Gruyter in 2020. And so I really liked Anne's contribution because it is talking about basically historical game preservation, and this kind of instance here where it's a game that came out in 2010, but it didn't reach Western audiences until the developers worked with a fan translation of this JRPG and then published it in this year, 2022. And God hope that some of these fan translators got some money from this. But it does bring up this topic of historical game preservation, which works well for the game I'd like to recommend to Best Old History Game, which is Atari 50. This is a collection of, in some cases, 50 years old Atari games that was put together by a new developer, but also kind of interested in historical game preservation, Digital Eclipse. And so Atari 50 includes basically a huge catalog. I think it's over 100 games of Atari's kind of back catalog going back to 1972. And in addition to that back catalog of games, including things like Combat and Missile Command, it also includes new short documentaries that Digital Eclipse filmed with some of these old developers who actually made these games. And so the game Atari 50, it works in a sense as a collection of old games, but it works even better as almost a museum piece on the history of Atari. And I think it's so easy to recommend and compelling because it is something that kind of updates these old games, but also gives you a lot of context behind why these games are important, why they're interesting, and then also shares with you kind of firsthand stories from the people who made them. And I think this is the way that I want kind of history games or historical games to be presented in the future, is that I don't want to go to a museum. I don't want to read about them in a book. I want them in packages like this, where not only am I getting kind of the museum level context of the game, but then I can actually also play the game that they're talking about at the same time. And I feel like, I've gone to many game museums. I live about 20 minutes away from the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. And I've just never had as great or as compelling as an experience with old games as I have with Atari 50.
Awesome. I love that we're getting there. Radiohead had that kind of interactive exhibit thing on Epic Games. I think that was last year. It was earlier this year. Blizzard have kind of done something in this direction, but nothing of what you're describing here. Yeah, my old game is a cheat. It's Crusader Kings 3, which, as I said to Bob before we started recording, I got my Steam Wrapped yesterday, or whatever they call it, but it's the Spotify Wrapped, but Steam is doing one. And they may as well have called it John, Cower in Shame. You spent a lot of time playing Crusader Kings 3. In my defense, I figured out a way to create an Irish / Catalan family that controlled all of Europe for about 100 years. That was fun. I want to throw one in, though. I do this to Bob every time. Listeners can't tell because they don't know. But before we record, we lay out what we're going to do. And almost every podcast Bob and I do, I think of something while he's talking and I throw it on him. So Bob doesn't know this is happening, and it wasn't mentioned earlier. But The Legend of Tianding, which is a game I really have to do for History Respawn soon, which is a side-scrolling action platformer game set in colonial Taiwan. That is to say, Taiwan under the control of the Japanese. Which is not a period that gets a lot of interest, at least in the West, typically. Just a beautiful looking game. It's on sale, 50% off right now on Steam, which I'm guessing makes it $10 or so, $15 maybe. And it just looks and sounds great and is wonderful. And people should think about it. It's kind of a left field choice. And if you don't play it, I'll be talking about it soon.
Yeah, I mean, if ever there was a game that was made just for John Harney, it's this one. I mean, that's just outrageous. Like I think we talked about it in like a text chain or something like that, or maybe I'd sent it. I can't remember what happened, but I just remember thinking like, gosh, it's like somebody just developed a game just for John. Like this is John's honeypot right here.
And it's great. It's a good game, and it's not like with Cult of the Lamb. Well, Cult of the Lamb can really drag you in, but Legend of Tianding is not a hugely demanding game of you, which I like. I'm in it as a compliment.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to our most anticipated game of 2023. This is most anticipated history game of 2023. And I'll start things out by talking about some games that were mentioned at the Game Awards, which occurred earlier in December. And so in the Game Awards, you have awards for games this year, but mostly this Jeff Keighley produced event is about promoting games that are coming out next year. And so two of those games caught my eye. First is a sequel to Valiant Hearts. Valiant Hearts is a Ubisoft game that was kind of a exploration of the First World War, beginning of the First World War. And so now we're getting a sequel to Valiant Hearts called Valiant Hearts Coming Home. And so this is another Ubisoft game that they are developing in partnership with Netflix. So Netflix, the video streaming platform, has gotten into games, particularly mobile games, kind of in a big way this year. And so in 2023, they're going to debut Valiant Hearts Coming Home, and I love the first Valiant Hearts. We covered it in one of our first videos for History Respawn, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen with this upcoming game. And then the second one is another game that was announced at the Game Awards, and that game is Hades 2. So Hades, I know, I'm so excited. Hades,
Bob's honeypot game.
I know, right? Hades 1 from Supergiant Games. This was kind of the consensus game of the year back in 2020. This is an action roguelite set in the Greek underworld. We did a really good episode with Kate Cook for that game. And so now Hades 2 is coming out. And you are playing the princess of the underworld fighting against the Titan Kronos. And so this is kind of a new player character, new god, or I should say, I guess, a Titan. that you were fighting against, and I mean, all you had to say was Hades 2, and I'm there. But I mean, the setting and the player character seems really compelling as well.
Cool. Yeah, that was such a rare thing in video game world, a surprise trailer where like the music clicks in, you're like, "Oh my God, that's the Hades music."
Yeah.
A real like wrestling, oh my God, that's his music kind of moment. And first, Bob, I swear to God, first thing I thought of was Bob must be so happy. The first thought
I think Return of the Obra Dinn is the only game that I've liked more these past couple decades than Hades 1. So
which tells its own thing.
That's a whole story.
I have we can give a couple of shout outs, a couple of big games coming out in the next year, hopefully. Assassin's Creed Mirage. You know, it's in our History Respawn contracts to talk about Assassin's Creed all the time, because we have to. And Diablo 4, which could be very exciting. Let's see what comes out with that. My personal choice, though, I would like to choose Contraband from Avalanche Studios, but I don't know if it's coming out in 2023. We actually haven't heard about it in a long time, which is making me a little bit worried. Very stylish trailer, kind of teaser trailer back in 2021, which it's supposed to be a co-op heist game is what they're saying it is. But what I liked about that teaser was it's in a place called Bayan, which is the Filipino word for nation. So it's the Philippines, basically. And it has this kind of 1970s. And of course, the Philippines, from an American perspective, is a post-colonial situation, right? So, like, there's a lot of that. I'm really excited to see where that goes. Let's cross our fingers and hope for the best. But a game that I know is coming out next year would be Mask of the Rose from Fail Better Games. For people who don't know, they made the game Sunless Seas and Sunless Skies, as well as the browser game Fallen London. So all their games are set in this Fallen London, which is kind of a I don't know how to describe it.
Dystopian, Victorian. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting is what it is.
It's interesting, and they've gone all in, and you can go to the Fallen London game online to check it out. Sunless Skies and Sunless Seas I think, are both excellent games. Mask of the Rose is a different vibe, more of a kind of a visual novel kind of approach. But still in that kind of quasi or alternative Victorian London thing. So Mask of the Rose is my kind of real pick, and I hope it's great. I think it will be. I've liked everything they've done so far.
Yeah.
So
that's another one of those developers we were talking about. Paradox, talking about Charles Game. I feel like Fail Better Games is right in that wheelhouse of these developers. These are people to watch for history or history adjacent content. Yeah, so looking forward to that. All right, let's move on to our second to last category, penultimate category for these History Game Awards. And this category is non-history game of 2022. So these are games that aren't directly related to history. They might have some kind of historical angles to them. But these are games that we just really, really liked and we wanted to give an award to. So John, I'm going to make you go first because I'm rude. John, tell me, what is your non-history game of 2022?
Sure. I'm going to go with a deep cut out of left field. No one's going to see this coming. Nobody else is picking this game. I think Elden Ring is the best non-history game of 2022.
Controversial.
I still haven't finished it, hilariously enough. I figure I had a realization in the last couple of months that the reason I like Dark Souls games is because I'm effectively meditating when I play them. In the sense of I'm just kind of completely focused on them, not thinking about anything else. Elden Ring, weirdly, it might not feel this way to people who haven't played one of these games before. It's far and away the most accessible Souls-like game. And it's also, I think it's the best one they've done. I think it looks wonderful. The character work is better. You could argue that it's an historical element to it. It has that same kind of dark medieval, what do people from Japan who've decided to interpret European medieval history in the weirdest way they possibly can on purpose. What did they create? The answer is Elden Ring, and it's fantastic. It's a great game. I'm sure people listening have heard about it, and I've heard that it's a great game. Elden Ring is crazy good. Are we doing honorable mentions as well?
Yeah, go ahead and do your honorable mention.
Yeah, honorable mention then would be Stray, which is, I loved Stray. It's about 5 hours, I think, 6 hours
This is
maybe.
for the listener, this is the cat game.
This is the cat game. Thank you. So you're controlling a cat. I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't want to ruin anything. It's a beautiful game in terms of how it tells its own story. It is a kind of a dystopian setting, I suppose. But Stray, if you have a PC or a PlayStation, I really think Stray is worth your time, and it's like an afternoon if you happen to have one, a long afternoon, admittedly. And I was very touched by Stray, and I am a cat owner. It's true. Maybe that was part of it.
You may
But
actually be
Stray was
recording
lovely.
surrounded by cats right now.
If you've heard, you may or may not have heard purring through half of the podcast, but it was great. How about you, Bob? What's your non-history game of 2022?
Yeah, so I'll start with my honorable mention. My honorable mention is Vampire Survivors, which is I think there's a kind of a genre for this, kind of a clicker game. I prefer to call it a do nothing game. And so Vampire Survivors, you are in a kind of pixelated Castlevania like setting where you are trying to survive 30 minutes of being attacked by ghouls and goblins and zombies, but not vampires, weirdly enough. And you are only have one control, and that is to use the stick to move your character. And as you move around, your character produces basically what could be described as bullet hell, right? You pick up power-ups that allow you to increase the number of projectiles, the different variety of weapons that you're using, but you are not actually pushing buttons, right? The game automatically attacks for you in kind of a set sequence. And so this is a game that stole about 30 hours of my life, playing it on the Steam Deck, hashtag first world problems, and then also playing it on Xbox Game Pass. But you don't need to get Game Pass to afford this game because right now it's on sale for $4. And let me tell you that this game is worth about $70 in terms of entertainment value. It may sound really simple, but there's kind of a lot of nuance to this game and an understanding what power-ups to pick up and when and how to move your character around the stage. But even though there's nuance, even though there's kind of complicating factors that come in later on, it's also a great game to play while somebody else is watching television, right? If you're sitting there on a mobile device, and it's also on iPhones, I should say, sitting there playing this while you're waiting at a bus stop, or sitting and playing this with your daughter. In my case, my 8-year-old daughter, who loves to play this game, loves to talk to me about this game, loves to watch me play it. But then also to play it while we're watching television, right? While we're watching cartoons or something like that. So it's kind of an idle game. I get another category it could fall into, but it's one that I have not idly been thinking about. I've been actively thinking about this game for much of the fall, and it's fantastic. But even better than Vampire Survivors, my official nominee for non-history game of 2022 is NORCO, from the developers Geography of Robots. So NORCO is a point-and-click adventure game that is set in a kind of cyberpunk version of NORCO, Louisiana. So this is a game that is set in a oil company town in the kind of Delta region of southeastern Louisiana. The reason why I picked this game was because I think more than any other game that I think I've ever played, NORCO does an amazing job of capturing a sense of a place. So it is kind of a near future version of NORCO, Louisiana, but it is one that is taking kind of inspiration from current politics, current culture, current environmental issues related to living in Louisiana. And this game really spoke to me kind of in an emotional way, because I spent 5 years of my life living in Louisiana, working at Louisiana Tech before I moved back to Texas with my family. And, I lived in Northwest Louisiana, so quite a ways away from NORCO itself. But so much of the world that is portrayed in NORCO, the kind of perspective of the player character, the kind of dialogue of the NPCs that you run into, the kind of material culture of Louisiana is just so accurately portrayed, and it's a heart-wrenching game. There is a lot of humor in it, but it is also a game that you really feel the weight of what living in Louisiana is like. And, for those of you who don't know, Louisiana is kind of center stage for the environmental crisis in the United States, in terms of oil production, in terms of climate change, in terms of massive storms and, pollution, and how all of those things interact. And it's in NORCO that I felt like I got it's the most accurate sense of a place that I've ever gotten. And I can speak to that a bit from living there for 5 years, in the sense, that over the past few decades that Louisiana is a forgotten place with forgotten people, and that it's a place where nothing good can be sustained over a long period of time. And there's kind of a hopelessness to the state that the people there are aware of, but they fight against it. And I just think NORCO does a really amazing job of capturing that. And to be straight with you all, I played this game on Game Pass. I just thought, okay, I'll play an hour of it and see what it's like, and then move on. It's because I need to play other games for this podcast, this episode of History Respawn. And I started NORCO, and I stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning finishing it. Like, I just could not put it down. And it's just an unbelievable experience. And I recommend it if you like old-fashioned point-and-click adventure games, but I also recommend it if you are interested in kind of an amazing story. It's a great story, regardless of whether it's a game or a book or a movie. It's just a great, great story. So NORCO, my non-history game of the year for 2022.
Awesome. I feel like we should have sound effects. Applause or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible experience. Just amazing. I couldn't recommend it more highly, especially for people who, maybe listen to this, who are from Louisiana. I think it really does an amazing job of kind of capturing the feeling of that state, and the people and the politics and the culture and the material culture. Again, like, you go into a pub, you go into a place of business, and you see like, off in the distance, there's the drive-by daiquiri place. And then, okay, this character has got an LSU poster in their office, and that's not at all out of place, anywhere in the state of Louisiana. And it's just, so I wasn't in the Southeast, but there's just so much homogeneity with the culture and the feeling and the kind of, ideology of Louisiana that permeates this game. And I think that the developers, who I think most of them are from this area of Louisiana, I think they've just done a fantastic job of capturing that and capturing the problems with this current crisis with the state and then with the country at large. It's just fantastic. I loved it. Fantastic. All right, are we ready for our last category, history game of 2022? And to lead us into our last discussion, the game that we are going to award the highest prize from History Respawn, I've got our last contribution from our guest recordings.
Hi, my name is James Coltrane, and I'm an assistant professor of game art at the University of Connecticut. And I'm the founder of and lead developer at Historiated Games, the studio behind the Indiecade award-winning historical game Blackhaven. I'm afraid I'm not going to be terribly original based on the buzz I've been seeing online, but my history game of 2022 is Pentiment. I'm only about halfway through this 2D historical narrative, which is set in 16th century Bavaria, but I've already been incredibly impressed with the wide range of cultural and historical information it's able to convey in a thoughtful murder mystery. I think the art of the game in many ways is emblematic of its overall approach to history. The game takes inspiration from late medieval illuminated manuscripts that were produced just after the advent of printing, and it uses miniatures and marginalia as well as books of hours, calendars, and other motifs to show transitions between scenes. The art style is bright, colorful, and consistent with period styles, but it's also not afraid to simplify and generalize when it makes for a more clear UI or user experience for players. This mix of richness and practical compromise is found throughout the game, and it gives players both tons of relevant historical detail, but also enough expository content to prevent them from getting lost or bored. It puts us in the shoes of a middling artisan, and we get introduced to daily life, agriculture, cosmology, theology, politics, art and architecture, social networks, and etiquette of the period, and we meet a broad swath of society from shepherds and nuns to clergy and nobles. The game is also committed to adding a wealth of information to a dynamically updating journal, allowing players to refer to an interactive glossary to clear up confusion and help them track the murder mystery as they go along. In many ways, the game reminds me of and improves upon the sort of contextual teaching done by last year's The Forgotten City. Gameplay-wise, the persistent but subtly changing small town also is reminiscent of one of my 2D favorite narratives, Night in the Woods. While it's moving things in the right direction, the one critique I have is I still want to see games push the limits of how far we can immerse players in historical worlds without having to be so on the nose while we're teaching them. Like in many narrative period games, there are still conversations where the characters speak as if they themselves are learning key points for the first time, almost like they're taking cues from AP history flashcards. The game's discussions of Luther's writings, for instance, felt somewhat clinical to me, as if the script was already aware of a future Reformation that would still be in its infancy for the game's characters. Nevertheless, that's only a small quibble. This is an absolutely awesome game and a model for how we can cram a huge amount of historical learning into a tight and entertaining story. So Pentiment is my history game of 2022. I hope everyone listening buys a copy and enjoys this rich journey as soon as they can. As far as my studio Historiated, we will soon be announcing our second historical title, an all-ages VR game that will release in late summer of 2023. So if you're interested in that, be sure to follow us on Twitter at HistoriatedGame for more updates. Happy New Year, everybody.
So that was the historian and game developer, James Coltrane, known best for his game Blackhaven, which we covered on History Respawn. And from James, we've got another nomination for Pentiment. And so that's James nominating Pentiment, Kate Cook nominating Pentiment, and I, too, am nominating Pentiment for the history game of 2022. Just to add on to what Kate and James have said, I think that this game does an amazing job of giving the player a quick sense of not just life in the 16th century for one player character, right, for Andreas, the kind of primary player character of Pentiment, but then also through the kind of experiences and the dialogue with NPCs, you also get a better sense of kind of not just the perspective of Andreas, but then the townspeople and the nuns and the clergy and travelers and the aristocracy, all getting caught up in a set of murder mysteries involving this small town of Tassing, but then also the ways in which the world has changed and how that change is affecting them, not only through the discovery of the New World, but then the onset of the printing press, Martin Luther, as James was talking about there, the Reformation, and then later on in the game getting into other topics, not only looking forward into the early modern era, but then also looking back into the medieval era and even the ancient era, and how all of that history is affecting the lives and continuing to affect the lives of people going forward. And I talked about NORCO as a game that gives you an amazing sense of place and an amazing sense of kind of lived experience, and I think Pentiment does that as well.
Yeah, that's all sounds amazing. I need to play Pentiment. I'm starting to get a sense of what the game of the year is, but I didn't go with Pentiment because I haven't played it. I went with Card Shark, which I talked about a few times in this podcast. And funnily enough, actually, I think the two games that you and I, Bob, are kind of going with, you're going with Pentiment, I'm going with Card Shark. First of all, I like Card Shark. It was fun to play. It still is fun to play. I'm still playing it. But again, you're somewhat Pentiment in the way that it's kind of opening up these different kind of ways of looking different eras and everything. What I like about Card Shark, we've had for the last couple of years talking about colonization, imperialism, and words like that, and in the context of really kind of important, social things like, living in the United States, for example, the murder of George Floyd, right, and things like this, and Black Lives Matter, and all these kinds of ideas. And I think that lots of energies have been released, which are really good. In the certainly in our line of work, I think lots of positive things have come out of it in terms of the kind of things that are now being encouraged, and some of the things up in the classroom a bit more easily than they used to, without needing to kind of push it so hard. But I also think we're a little bit guilty, and I'm a 20th century specialist, so I'm as guilty as anybody else of doing this. We're a little bit guilty of getting really focused on kind of this modern perspective, as if everything began in 1850. And what I like about Card Shark is that, you play this put upon person who, if the Comte de Saint-Germain doesn't take you under his wing, you're just gonna, have this, sharp, brutish, short experience, and then it's over. After you meet the Comte de Saint-Germain, the next characters you meet are Romani characters, which is like the game very deliberately making a point of like, you're the outsiders and you're going to cheat the ancien regime. You're going to cheat the haves, but you're the have-not. And without being preachy, I like the way the game does that. So for me, there's two things. There's kind of, sadly, humans have sucked before the modern age of imperialism. But also, of course, this is France in the 1700s. France is an imperial state at that point. And there's people in France who are also suffering from the same systems that are punishing people outside of France. I mean, the television show Peaky Blinders certainly did this the first two seasons, for example. It's like, hey, if you live in Birmingham in 1920, your life is terrible. Like basically, in different ways from the ways that being Indian is terrible, for example.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I really like that, and I just think that it's such a pleasure. These are games that people used to think of as smaller games or whatever, and the lines between small indie produced games and big games are blurring all the time. And thematically, as people who like historical games, we're winning all the time. It's just, I feel so spoiled, and I am so happy to be spoiled. And I'm happy to see Pentiment get Game of the Year, but I'm also happy to be able to give Card Sharks its druthers a little bit before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, we'll say Pentiment number 1, Card Shark number 2. I have no problem with that
works
order.
For me.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think just to piggyback off your point there, it's amazing to me. I went into 2022 expecting to pick a AAA game as my history game of the year. And in particular, thinking about Horizon Forbidden West, just assuming going into the year that was going to be my game of the year. And here we are, and we've got two indie games, Pentiment winning, but then Card Shark coming in runner up. And, this is not what you would have expected. At least I wouldn't have expected. And yet it speaks to the strength, not only of history games as a genre, but then also the strength of independent developers who can do really fun, cool, nuanced things with these histories. And, whether it's Card Shark, and the amazing way that it brings in historical detail without hitting you over the head with it. Or if it's Pentiment, where it's kind of based off of the developer's long-term interest in medieval history, and also using historians in the development process and including a bibliography in the game's credits so that you can follow that up. It's kind of a labor of love, a decades-long labor of love with the kind of early modern medieval past. And I think that's, like you said, it's really exciting to be not only living in an era where those kind of games can come out, but also being a part of something like History Respawn, where we get to talk about it. It's really great. And I'm really happy that you're on board, John, but then also that we had our four guests, James, Kate, Chris, and Anne, who were willing to share with us their kind of views. And so it's not just two of us talking about it, even though that'd still be a fantastic episode. But I feel like this worked pretty well. I hope you feel the same way, John, and maybe we can do some more of this with episodes in the future.
It was awesome. I'm very grateful to our guests. Thanks so much, guys.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this Game of the Year episode. And hope you enjoyed all of History Respawn's work over the past year. We've got more episodes scheduled for 2023. The history games never stop. They won't stop, whether they're coming from AAA developers or from indie developers. We will try to cover as much as we can, even though it's impossible to cover it all. We'll do our best. And if you enjoy our work, please consider visiting us at historyrespawn.com, where you can find our back episodes. And then if you really enjoy our work, if you want to help us continuing this analysis and coverage of history games, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/history respawn. And I think with that brings an end to this History Game of the Year episode. Happy New Year to those of you who are listening. Happy holidays. And John, I'll leave you with the final words.
Happy New Year, and thanks for listening and watching and reading the website, and keep coming back. We're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. Is that right, Bob?
We're not going anywhere. All right,
everyone.
Bye, listeners.